Today's session is going to be quite an important one. Today we are in Matthew 24, verses 15 through 31. Now, this is going to be the last part within the second section that we've been looking at over the last few days since we started the fast. So again, we have the question in Matthew 24, verses 1 through 3. When, what, and what? And now what we're looking at, we looked at the birth pains of verses 4 through 8. Then we looked at the social pressures of verses 9 through 14. And today we're looking at the beginning. We're going to look at three things today. The beginning of the tribulation, the unequaled intensity or severity of the tribulation, and the consummation or completion or ending, climax of the Great Tribulation. How it begins, how severe it is, and how it ends. That's what we're going to be looking at today. And that constitutes the sign of the end of the age. This is where the signs move from general to very specific, where we transition from no one knows the day or the hour to you can start your countdown. Because now you know with certainty when he's coming and how the rest of this thing is going to unfold. This is the highest peak in terms of eschatological texts that describe the signs of the times and how you can know the generation of the Lord's return and why you must know the generation of the Lord's return. And it will be clear as we move through this that you're going to see that how the gravity, that's the right word that I'm looking for, the gravity of this event described in verse 15. Everything around the end of the age scenario hangs on this event in verse 15. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Remember, we had the birth pains, the social pressures, the gospel's breaking out, there's war, there's mass division taking place, there's mass martyrdom taking place, there's starvation, there's famine, there's pestilence breaking out, but it's just the beginning. Verse 15. So when, now remember verse 3, when will be all these things? Now remember, what are these things? Let's go back to it so it's fresh in our mind and we're sharp thinking about this. Remember chapter 23, verse 37, 38, 39. He said this, your house will be left to you desolate. The desolation of Jerusalem, your house, the temple will be left desolate, which means the city of Jerusalem has been invaded and is being destroyed. You will not see me again, so the second coming of Jesus, until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, meaning Jerusalem is welcoming Messiah into the city gates. So we have the temple, the city of Jerusalem, the second coming of Jesus, and the welcoming him back into the city gates. These are the four events that are laid out in the end of chapter 23 that the disciples then ask, when will these things be? These four things are the things that he's referring to. And I want us to be super clear about this as we move forward, because if that's lost, none of this stuff really makes sense because you don't see the context and the connectivity here. So they said, when will these things be in verse 3? And he's answering it now very explicitly in verse 15. This is where he gets to the heart and the jugular of it. So when you see the abomination of desolation, remember back in verse 38, your house will be left to you desolate. When they heard that, they go, whoa, the desolation of Jerusalem, he's quoting the book of Daniel now. And in our next sessions, we're actually going to be looking at these passages in the book of Daniel. But look at this, verse 15. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in where? Standing in the holy place. What's the holy place? It's the temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem where Jesus just came from and said, not this house will be left desolate. So you have the terminology here. He's now expounding on what he meant. In other words, he just said that sentence in chapter 23, your house will be left to you desolate. And now the disciples are going to explain it. And he goes, Daniel explained it. If you want to understand it, study Daniel, which again, we're going to look at it in another session. But Daniel 8, verses 13 and 14 mention this event. Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27, specifically the end of Daniel 9, 26, 27, this event is described. And more importantly and more clearly, in Daniel chapter 11, verses 21 through the end of Daniel chapter 12, that whole long portion of scripture in Daniel 11 and 12 revolves around the abomination of desolation. This is the central event that the prophecies of Daniel revolve around, this catalytic event that sets everything in motion. And Jesus is saying, look, Daniel already spoke about it, so I'm not going to elaborate on it. And then he says this, let the reader understand. In other words, guys, you already know the signs if you read Daniel. Go read Daniel. And I think the lack of, most preaching and teaching on Daniel in Western pulpits is taken from the first 6 chapters of Daniel, which is all about Daniel's life, Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel in exile, Daniel not bowing down to the statue, it's the stories of Daniel. Once we get into the visions and the prophecies of Daniel, we go, that's a little too weird and crazy, and abomination and desolations and weird stuff. But Jesus is saying this, look, Daniel already laid it out for you. So in a way, I'm not even going to answer your question about what the signs are, because Daniel already laid it out. That's the sign right here. Verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel standing in the holy place, it's go time. I mean, that's your sign. Guys, Daniel. Daniel said, when you see this, the time of the end is at hand. It's barreling forward now. You can't stop it. Not only that, but you can now start to count the days, because Daniel told you the specific days from the time that the temple is rebuilt until the time of the end. He also told you the number of days between the abomination of desolation being set up and the end of this present age and the inauguration of the next. So to a degree, no one knows the day or the hour until this day. Until this day, because once the abomination of desolation is set up, beloved, you can get on your watch, do a countdown of days until this age ends. You can know, you will know, and you must know that you're living in those days then, because it's going to get very intense, and you're going to need that information to stay steady when this stuff begins to break out. But this is the catalytic event, guys, is an event in Jerusalem already described by the prophet Daniel that takes place in the holy place in a temple that is an abominable thing that causes desolation. What is the abomination of desolation, Dalton? Well, we'll look at it when we get into Daniel, but let's just communicate it simply for now. The abomination of desolation is an abominable act that takes place in the holy place in Jerusalem that causes the desolation, or sets in motion the desolation, the decimation, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple. That's what is being set in motion here. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, go read Daniel, understand it. Verse 16, then, these are important timing words. Verse 16, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So if you pull up a map right now on one of your devices and you just look at where Jerusalem is and then Judean mountains, if you're in Judea, which is the biblical heartland of Israel, what he's saying is when the abomination of desolation, when you see that, you need to leave. You need to flee. You need to get out of Jerusalem as quickly as possible. Not only just Jerusalem, but if you're in Judea, you need to flee to the mountains. Now, the mountains are going to be moving towards the Dead Sea area. Now, there's some passages in Daniel that we're going to look at in coming days that's going to really put a lot of this in context, because some very unique things happen in Edom and Moab and Kedar and the northern Arabian Peninsula, the Arabian Desert areas today, which is modern day Jordan, around the Dead Sea, all the way down to Saudi Arabia and the Red Sea. There's a lot of events that take place biblically, eschatologically, in that area regarding Jewish refugees who have fled Jerusalem and Judea in a voluntary flight to escape the carnage that's bearing down on the city because of the abomination of desolation. Now, how many of you know the passage in Zechariah 12 where it says, I'm going to gather all nations against Jerusalem. All nations are going to gather against Jerusalem. And in chapter 14, it says that when they gather, half the city is going to go into captivity Today, hundreds of thousands of people live in Jerusalem. It's a very big city. Half of the city of Jerusalem is going to go into captivity. It says the houses will be pillaged and ransacked. It says the women will be raped. This city is going to be in rubble. And Jesus can say, when you see that all of that carnage begins the day that the abomination of desolation is set up. When that abominable act takes place on the Temple Mount and the invasions begin, he says, this guy's get out of Judea. You need to get out. You need to flee. So part of we're going to see multiple dynamics here. Look at this. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountain. Let them. It's voluntary. Guys, flee, get out, escape, run for your lives, head to the mountains, head towards the Judean wilderness, head toward the Masada area and keep going. There's going to be a corridor of refugees fleeing into the wilderness at this time. And we're going to also look at this later in future sessions, the subject of this future wilderness wandering, this future wilderness encounter, where Hosea says there's going to be this beautiful encounter happen with the people of Israel in this flight for their lives. We see passages like Ezekiel 20:22. We see passages like Jeremiah 30-33 describing those who find grace in the wilderness. Ezekiel says, I will meet with you face to face in the wilderness. Revelation 12 says, in the wilderness, there's a place prepared for her where she will be nourished for a time. Hosea says, in the wilderness, I'm going to allure you and speak tenderly to you there. It's going to be the place of encounter. The wilderness, again, is going to be like a second Exodus. Now, this is very important because within modern, let's call it Christian Zionism, those who support the state of Israel, who believe that there's a future for the Jewish people, who are not replacement theology, in general, the way that it's talked about 1948 until now is that the Jewish people came back to the land of Israel. Now that they're there, that the Holocaust was the proverbial dry bones of Ezekiel, and now there's going to be this progressive awakening and revival, and then Israel's going to accept Jesus, and he's going to come back, and the Lord's going to kill all Israel's enemies. And the state of Israel is going to be protected and preserved, and there's going to be some bad stuff that happens, but it's not going to be that severe. Guys, I just want to be very clear about this. If Jesus, with his own lips, is telling people to leave Judea, the whole region of Judea, when the Temple Mount is decimated and invaded, it is a false teaching to say that Israel is going to be protected from this time of tribulation and that this time of trouble is not going to be severe. I know many good people who are anticipating Israel being protected in these days, and they're not anticipating this kind of an event. But it's exactly this kind of event that we need to understand to prepare for, because not only so that we understand the severity of it and we're not shocked and disillusioned and offended, but so that we can play our role in it when that happens. Meaning this, there is going to be an unprecedented time of suffering for the Jewish people in the future, which is going to require unprecedented courage and bravery and sacrifice and love and selflessness and spirit-wrought sacrifice that the church has never displayed or demonstrated or walked in or ever seen. It's going to be World War II on steroids. What we're going to see in a moment here is that this time will far surpass every other time of tribulation since the world began. This is not something in the future that's going to be, the Holocaust will be eclipsed by this in terms of its severity. Look at this. Look at the language. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. In other words, guys, leave your stuff. Just get out quickly. Get out quickly. Verse 19, alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. What? Meaning this, when you have, I've got 4 kids, and I know that when you have like a nice car and air conditioning and you're driving from your comfortable living room to, let's say, a nice grocery store where everything's convenient and easy, if your wife is pregnant or if your wife is nursing babies, it's a hassle. even when everything is convenient, you've got all the amenities, all the luxuries. What he's saying is this: is guys, look, if you're gonna, there's gonna be a Jewish refugee crisis of Jewish people, Israelis, fleeing the state of Israel, fleeing Judea into the mountains because of a military invasion the likes that Israel has never experienced. I mean, Yom Kippur, the Yom Kippur in 1973, that war was catastrophic. The death toll was higher than the war. It was unimaginable, the colossal breakdown and meltdown of what happened in Yom Kippur. The tribulation is going to so far eclipse what happened in Yom Kippur. In Yom Kippur, the Sinai fell and the Golan fell for a period of about 3 days. And there was Israeli IDF troops in the Sinai and in the Golan who were holding it at bay, and they managed to hold it, and they retook the land. The coming Yom Kippur war is going to so far eclipse that because the Sinai and the Golan are going to fall. And when they fall, what we're going to see is Judea being overrun by foreign occupying invaders. You've heard the expression Armageddon, the Battle of Armageddon. There is no Battle of Armageddon. Armageddon is the staging area in northern Israel where all of these foreign occupying troops base for the operation to liberate Jerusalem from the Jewish people. It says this in Daniel 11, a text that we're going to look at in detail, that the Antichrist is going to set up his palatial tents or his military headquarters in between the Mediterranean and the Holy Mountain. Which, guys, do you know what's in the middle between today? What's between the Mediterranean and Jerusalem today? It's Ben Gurion Airport. That's the main road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It says that's where the Antichrist is going to have his military headquarters, is going to be between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which means this: the main road's been cut. The airport has been taken over. Jerusalem is now is bottlenecked. It's surrounded, and there's people fleeing into the wilderness. But don't let this be some, non-human thing. Like, this is going to affect women and their children that they're trying to nurse. Look at verse 20. Pray that your flight, that doesn't mean your airplane flight, your flight, meaning your escape. Pray that your escape may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. Why? Because if it's cold, you could die of frostbite and hypothermia by fleeing into the mountains and running. Israel's winters are cold. The desert, the wilderness, the mountains is cold, even in the desert. He's saying pray that it doesn't happen in the wilderness. And then happen in the winter. You don't want to be in the wilderness in the winter. And then he says, pray that it doesn't happen on a Sabbath. Why? Because if it happens on the Sabbath, the Orthodox, the religious community in Israel, they're not going to move because they don't want to violate the Sabbath laws. They're not going to use cars. They're not going to use buses. They're not going to move because they don't want to violate Sabbath. And Jesus is saying, this guy's pray that doesn't happen. So it's going to be very interesting to see when the abomination of desolation is set up, whether God in his sovereignty chooses to have it set up on the Sabbath or not. Because it means this: if it does happen on the Sabbath, the Orthodox are going to stay, which means this: the Orthodox are going to be under the heel of the occupying foreign invaders who are holding the city hostage for the duration of the tribulation, from the moment it begins with the abomination of desolation to the end. If it's not, the Orthodox will flee. But he's saying the Sabbath is going to complicate these events in incredible ways. Then he says this, verse 21, this is where it gets heavy. Now we've seen how the tribulation begins. How does it begin? Begins on the Temple Mount, in the holy place, in Jerusalem, in Judea, which sets in motion a flight and exile and escape into Judea, into the mountains, to leave the biblical heartland of Israel, to voluntarily escape as the military invasions are happening. Now, verse 21, we're going to see the second part of the dynamic is the unequaled severity of this time of trouble. Verse 21, for then, when the abomination of desolation is set up, for then there will be a time of great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Never will be. So history past, everything in history past will be eclipsed by this. And everything in history future, there's nothing after this. Nothing after it will eclipse this. This is the most unequaled, unprecedented, unparalleled time of tribulation the world will have ever known. But what I want to point out here, guys, is this. Then the tribulation begins. When? When the abomination of desolation is set up and established in the holy place. This is what Jesus was mentioning in Matthew 23. Now, this gets at this big question of, well, how do we know that the temple being destroyed in 70 AD was not this? Because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Wasn't that the end of the age? Like, wasn't that what he was talking about? Well, guys, yes, in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, but there was no abomination of desolation set up in 70 AD. The way that 70 AD unfolded was the military commander who took Jerusalem in 70 AD came in, he told everyone, don't touch the temple. It's a headache. Don't touch it. It's a holy place. We're not going to destroy this thing. Don't touch it. We're trying to put down the rebellion. We don't want to get entrenched in this religious war. Leave it alone. And hired Arab legions violated the order and attacked the temple and lit it on fire. Word came back to the commander, the general, and he said, look, the Arabs lit it on fire. And he goes, no. Scrape the gold off of it and save all the gold and roll all the stones into the valley, which is what they did. But the point is this, there was no abomination of desolation in 70 AD. There was just a military invasion. Now, there was a flight into the wilderness, and people in the day that heard Jesus' teaching who were alive at this time said, maybe this is that, we should flee. And they did. They fled into the wilderness. They fled to Masada. They fled into Moab and Edom. They left and fled into the nations where the Jewish diaspora and exile began and continued up until the Aliyah began in the 1800s, which culminated in 1948 in the Declaration of Independence for an independent state of Israel and the repatriation of Israel's homeland. But the point is, there was no abomination of desolation in 70 AD. There was simply a destruction of the temple, which doesn't meet the criteria, it doesn't meet the description. And moreover, it didn't lead to a time of great tribulation for the whole world that culminated in the second coming. If you want to say that the 70 AD culminated in the great tribulation, the end of the age, and where does the gymnastics linguistically end? And people do this. They say, for example, the renowned scholar N.T. Wright. Some of you may have heard his name. He's like the gold standard for conservative scholarship of our day. He's like the preeminent theologian. He says that in 70 AD, the end of the age happened, but Jesus didn't mean the end of the age. He meant the end of the Jewish age. And he said that when he describes himself coming on the clouds, that it wasn't the description of Jesus coming to us, returning. It was Jesus going away from us in the ascension, riding on the clouds of heaven. So coming means going, and end of the age doesn't mean end of the age, means Jewish age. And so Jesus did come in some phantom way to end the Jewish age and transition the identity and destiny of the national Israel to the church. This is replacement theology, which N.T. Wright would be frustrated at if we called it replacement theology, but it is replacement theology because it's saying in 70 AD, Jesus judged the temple, came back in some phantom way and left in some phantom way on the clouds, and took the identity, privileges, destiny, prophetically, covenantally of Israel and took it from them, sent them into exile, and then gave the benefits to the church, the new people. And Jewish people can join the church if they want to, but the church has taken on the identity and destiny of national Israel territorially, and they have lost their privileges and rights as a nation because they rejected Jesus. That's just basic replacement theology in a nutshell. Beloved, what happened in 70 AD was horrific, but what we see from the prophets and the apostles, and as we move through the next few days, you're going to see this, over and over again, the culmination of the day of the Lord, tribulation, Jacob's trouble, as Jeremiah called it, or this time of trouble such as never was, as Daniel called it in Daniel chapter 12, culminates in the salvation of Israel, not the disbursement, delegitimization of Israel. This is the big hallmark. I remember speaking with a theologian a number of years ago, and we were having a cordial debate about Zechariah 13. Zechariah 13 says this, that in those days when Jerusalem is surrounded by all nations, Zechariah 12, that 2/3 of the Jewish people will be cut off and will perish and die in those days. And we were talking about this future, the legitimacy of this idea of a future time of trouble for Israel. And this brother who is he's a scholar, loves Israel, not replacement theology, he said, look, I believe Matthew 24 is about 70 AD because of, look, as Zechariah 13 says 2/3, and in 70 AD, 2/3 of the Jewish people were killed. During that time, it just makes sense. The temple was destroyed, two-thirds of the people were killed. And so I said to my brother, I said, look, the problem with that theory is you're not reading the rest of the verse. What does the rest of the verse say in Zechariah 13? He said, well, I don't know. I said, well, we'll read it out loud. In that day, 2/3 will be cut off and will perish in the land. And then what will happen? The surviving remnant, the third that survives, will come through the fire refined, and they will be my people. They will call me their Lord, and I will call them my people. In 70 AD, the surviving remnant did not come through refined saying, you are my Lord, and the Lord saying, you are my people. Instead, it set in motion the hardening of the nation, the scattering of the nation, the diaspora of the nation, and the loss of the land, the loss of covenantal privileges. But what we see in Zechariah 13 is the opposite. It's the surviving remnant comes through and are regathered to the land. They're regenerated by the Spirit, and they're restored as a nation. Ethnically, territorially, they're restored to the nation and restored nationally. 70 AD brought about the scattering of the Jewish people. The Great Tribulation brings about the return of the Jewish people after the tribulation. Look at verse 22. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. No human flesh would survive, some translations say. If the tribulation wasn't cut off, if Jesus doesn't personally intervene and end it, no flesh will survive. That's a really heavy statement. And he goes on to say this. If anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Again, he goes back to this leading people astray issue. There's going to be a battle for truth and a massive conflict over the issue of what is happening and what God is asking of us as his people and what he's requiring and asking of the nations as these events are unfolding. So we can say this, the tribulation begins with an event in the temple in Jerusalem, in the holy place, that sets in motion a flight or an escape or an exile, an expulsion from the city of Jerusalem in the area of Judea, which sets in motion a time of unequaled tribulation such as the world has never experienced before, and such that if Jesus didn't personally end himself, no human flesh would survive. Now the question is, does that mean in Jerusalem and Judea, or does that mean globally for the whole world? No flesh would survive. I'm partial to the idea that the flesh surviving thing is specific to Jerusalem and to Israel because of that's the epicenter. But if that's taking place there, around the world, the same dynamics are going to be taking place, but at a lesser degree, because Jerusalem is where everything is going down. But I don't think, people in Fiji and, Indonesia are going to be experiencing the tribulation the same way. Now, are they going to be affected by it? Yes, absolutely, but not the way Jerusalem and Judea are. And so the all flesh surviving thing, does that mean globally or just in the region? We don't know. What we do know is there's passages in Isaiah, for example, that say that in those days, men will be like rare, fine gold. We know this from Luke 21, that men's hearts will fail from fear on that day because this will come upon the whole earth like a snare. The whole earth like a snare. Men, small men, rich men, wise men, poor men, mighty men, weak men, will hide themselves in the rocks and the mountains, asking the mountains to fall on them in these days, it says in Revelation 6, saying, what? Hide us from the wrath of the Lamb. The judgment events are going to be so severe that people are going to be wanting to die. And Jesus is saying here, look, guys, if I don't cut these days short, no one's going to survive. That's how intense it's going to be. And in that context, there's going to be false signs and wonders breaking out. For time's sake, we're going to jump down to verse 29 and spend our last number of minutes here in verse 29 through 31. We're going to look at 4 events that take place in succession. This is where we get to the culmination. So we've already looked at the beginning of the tribulation. Now we've looked at the unequaled severity of the tribulation. Now we're going to look at the consummation and completion and ending of the tribulation, how it ends. He's going to mention 4 events, okay? Verse 29, immediately after, okay? Immediately after. That's very important. After. the tribulation of those days. Okay? After the tribulation of those days. This is very important. So event number 1 is the great tribulation of those days. Now bear in mind, what are those days? It's the tribulation that's set in motion by the abomination of desolation that's preceded by birth pains and corresponding social pressures. So the birth pains set everything off and begin escalating, and corresponding social pressures, the gospel's breaking out, division all over the world. And then in verse 15, the abomination of desolation is set up that sets in motion the tribulation of those days after event number 1, the tribulation of those days. So we can say this, the first event is the tribulation that follows on the heels of what we've already looked at is the abomination. So now, abomination of desolation, great tribulation. Now look at immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. We could call this event number 2, we call this cosmic disturbance, meaning signs in the sky. You know, Joel described this, Isaiah described this, Zechariah describes this, the book of Revelation describes this. The sky is going to be a very revealing sign at the time. We're going to see lots of bizarre things happen. The sun darkened and moon not giving light. Everything's going to go dark in preparation for this final light show before the Lord appears in flaming fire. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul talks about, guys, look, you're being afflicted and persecuted right now, but listen, take heart, take courage, because he's going to come in flaming fire one day and light up the sky with a loud trumpet blast that's going to blow your eardrums out. The drama, you know, in his first coming, you know, a couple shepherds watched what happened, right? This second coming, all the nations of the earth are going to see this as the sky globally goes dark in preparation for this final sign. The third sign that happens is this. This is where it's funny. I just think this is comical to me. Verse 30, then, okay, look at the timing. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. Remember, verse 3, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? He goes, then will appear the sign. He's answering their question explicitly now. Jesus, what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? And he says, after the tribulation, then will be the sign that you've been wondering about. He goes, well, what's the sign, Jesus? And he says this, all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He's quoting Daniel chapter 7. You will see the Son of Man. You go, Jesus, what's the sign? He says, the sign is me coming. That's the sign. Wait, what? The sign of your coming is you coming? He goes, yep. Okay, I guess that's pretty unmistakable then. That's not going to be a sign that we're going to be going, I wonder if this is it. Is this the sign? He goes, guys, it's going to move from maybe he's coming to, okay, abomination of desolation. It's go time to, oh, it's dark. There's no light. The tribulation is now over. Everything is dark. The world is hushed. The cosmos is silent. Everything is hushed. And now you will see coming on the clouds in flaming fire with power and great glory. You'll see the sign. Jesus, the Son of Man, the one prophesied by Daniel, coming on the clouds of heaven. That's your sign. So we can say this. These are the 4 signs, okay? The tribulation of those days, cosmic disturbance that begins after the tribulation, and then on the heels of that, we have the coming of the Son of Man, which then sets in motion the 4th and final event, which is verse 31. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And that ends this section of prophecy. From verse 32 on, it's the parables. But that's it. That's Jesus' teaching on the end of the age and the signs of the times. So let's back up and walk through this thing again to see the simplicity of this. Because again, we're not interpreting anything here. We're just reading and affirming what the text says. And again, there's no interpretation. There's no metaphor. There's no symbolism. Jesus looks at Jerusalem, the religious leaders, and says, your house will be left to you desolate. You won't see me again until you say this. They go, Jesus, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your return at the end of the age? And Jesus says, okay, here's the deal, guys. You're going to have birth pains, which looks like this. Then you're going to have corresponding social pressures that's going to look like this. Then in the midst of that, as the gospel's going forth and the nations are teetering in this preliminary context-setting crises that's breaking out all over the world, the singular event that's going to be the catalyst for this thing breaking out will be the abomination of desolation. That event begins the time of tribulation, and the time of tribulation will culminate in, after the tribulation, cosmic disturbance, everything going dark, Jesus appearing in the sky, and then Jesus gathering his elect. This is what we would call the rapture. The rapture and the second coming are one event. It's not two events. It's not like there's a rapture and then there's the second coming and then there's another rapture. That would be 2, 3 comings now that we're talking about. It gets very confusing and very unnecessary considering the fact that throughout the scriptures, and there's only 4, all 4 say that the second coming happens after the tribulation. Now let's close with this. Let's look at those 4 passages. I'm going to reference them. You can open them now or just write them down and listen and go back later. Here's the 4 passages. Passage number 1, which is encouraging because it's only 4. You don't have to study 100 passages. It's only 4. Passage number 1, we just looked at it. The gathering of the saints happens when Jesus appears in the sky in clouds after the cosmic disturbance, after the tribulation. Okay, so there's no pre-tribulation rapture there. Nowhere in Matthew 24 is there a pre-tribulation rapture. Now let's look at the other 3 passages. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul says this. He goes, guys, Thessalonians, you're writing to me asking about concerning the day of the Lord and our gathering together to meet him when he comes. So Paul ties together 3 events and calls them one and the same. The day of the Lord, the coming of the Lord, and our gathering together. He calls that one singular day and says that day will not come until, number 1, the man of sin is revealed, the Antichrist, the one who sets up the abomination of desolation, and 2, until the great falling away happens. Until these 2 events happen, the day of the Lord has not come. Which means this, the Antichrist precedes the day of the Lord, the coming of the Lord, and our gathering together to the Lord, which is one day. Which makes sense concerning the fact that Jesus just said, abomination of desolation, then tribulation, then Jesus appears, and the day he appears, he gathers us. He gathers us the day he appears, not 3.5 years before that, and then another round at the end to collect everyone else who was, got saved during the tribulation. It's not that's just goofy. That's not in the Bible. That is not anywhere in the Bible. It's completely a fabrication that was made up. The third passage is in 1 Corinthians 15. I believe it's verses 51 and 52. He says this, look, right now we have corruptible, weak bodies, but there's coming a day when our bodies will be swallowed up in immortality and we're going to receive resurrected bodies. Just like Jesus got a resurrected body, we're going to get a resurrected body. And he said, I speak a mystery. That clothing of immortality, that resurrection of our mortal bodies right now is going to happen at the 7th trumpet. The 7th trumpet. Now we know from the book of Revelation there's 7 trumpets, and the 7th trumpet is when the mystery of God is complete. The 7th trumpet sets in motion the sounding of the 7 bowls and the consummation, the end of the tribulation. So what's taking place in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, you're going to get a resurrected body, guys, at the 7th trumpet. And our last one, there's only one left, he says, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he says this, guys, look, those who've died in Christ, it's not as though one's going to precede another. When Jesus returns and there's going to be a great trumpet blast, when the great trumpet blast sounds, the dead in Christ will rise and we will meet them. if you are alive at the time of the coming of the Lord. And he again ties the coming of the Lord to the gathering together of the saints. But more than that, he ties together the gathering of the saints who have died before the return of the Lord with the gathering of the saints who are alive at his coming at the same time. And in the next passage in chapter 5, he says this, guys, Jesus is coming like a thief in the night, but you are not children of the night. You're children of the day. In other words, saying this, Jesus is coming to you as a bridegroom, not as a thief. He's only coming as a thief to those who sit in darkness. Now, this coming like a thief in the night has been used to justify or legitimize the idea of a pre-tribulation rapture, but the fact of the matter is, Paul says this, he's not coming as a thief to the church. He's coming as the bridegroom of the bride, his church. He's coming to marry her, not rob her. If you're getting robbed by Jesus on the day he returns, you're not part of the body. You're a child of darkness living in darkness. And that snare has come upon you because you live in darkness. But we who live in the light will be prepared for this and yearning for this, crying out, Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. So I hope this was helpful. Tomorrow, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of these parables, and then we're going to look at Daniel, and we're going to go through some of these passages in Daniel and Revelation to study what these texts say about this time, because Jesus, we don't have time to do it today, but Jesus is really giving a Bible study on the book of Daniel by doing what he just did. He's basically referring us back to Daniel. So we would be wise to study the book of Daniel to get understanding on this, because Jesus thought it was sufficient enough to just reference a verse from Daniel and to say that's enough. Like, that's really all you need to know about the signs of the times. Jesus says, go study Daniel. That's your book. If you want to understand the signs of the times, the end of the age, go study the book of Daniel, which is incredibly encouraging, because he's not saying, well, you got to know Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic and Latin, and you got to study, 50 books, and then you got to go read these scholars. He's going, no, just go read the prophet Daniel. And specifically, you only really need to read the 6 chapters of Daniel at the end of the book of Daniel, because those are the chapters that deal with this issue of the end of the age. So it's really 6 chapters that you need to study. So we're going to go study those 6 chapters in detail in the coming days ahead. So let's wrap this up by saying this. When will these things take place, and what will be the sign? Birth pains, social pressures, abomination of desolation, great tribulation, cosmic disturbance, second coming of Jesus, gathering together of the saints. That's the timeline of biblical eschatology. You now know the signs. Not only do you now know the signs, you know the story arc and structure, and you know how the story ends, which means this: you can now explain it to people with a steady hand. But now what we need to do is take time to get this in us, so that when we close our eyes, the text is in us because we've outlined it and studied it and become so familiar with it that we don't necessarily need the Bible. And you've probably noticed that as I've been going through this, I don't have notes in front of me, and I'm reading it because I want to read it to us. But the point is that what we want is to get to a point where these passages are in us. We don't actually need it. So wherever we are, whether we're in isolation and quarantine with no electricity, maybe we're in a prison camp, maybe we're on the run as refugees because the places that we're living are getting hammered in this military conflict. Maybe you're in the earthquake, maybe you're in the pestilence, maybe you're in the famine and food shortage, maybe. The point is this: we want to get a vision for crisis in the coming days, that we could be people of endurance, and that we could be people who are calm and steady and at peace in those days, because we've sowed into the Word of God, and now we're reaping in the place of revelation and authority to give a faithful witness when these things are going down. Now, one last point before we wrap this up. How do you know that Matthew 24 is not talking about 70 AD? Here's one of the reasons. There's 50, but here's one of the reasons why. Jesus connects the gathering of the saints and the coming of the Lord to the tribulation of those days. You can't separate it. I can't tell you how many scholars and academics I've argued with over the years who have said, no, it's talking about 70 AD. And I go, guys, if grammar means anything, when Jesus says immediately after the tribulation of those days, he's referring to the tribulation that began with the abomination of desolation, which means this: And this is a crucial point. The second coming end of the age scenario cannot come and will not come until there is a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem that the abomination of desolation could be set up in. Which means this, one of the premier signs that we are moving towards the day of the Lord will be when we see the Temple Mount, a rebuilt third temple established on the Temple Mount. And when we see the holy place being set back up again for sacrifices, because when the holy place is set back up, the context is now set for the abomination of desolation to unfold. And then we will be on the cusp of the end of the age and the return of the Lord. And that is the singular sign. Everything else is trends, events, developments, and maybe. But when you see the temple rebuilt, everything is now in motion, and we are living on the edge of the age to come. So with that, bless you, and Maranatha.